would like to introduce Professor Dean Peter Todd, the new Dean of the Business School, who will be followed by Professor Robert Kosowski, the head of the Finance Department, and our Academic Director and Executive Director, Enrico Biffis, and Mike Wilkins. Thank you.
Thank you, Dalia, and I recognize you have a very full agenda today, so I'll try to be brief. They've told me I must anchor myself behind this microphone, so if you don't see me wandering too much, that will be why. And for any colleagues who were I did a town hall last week or a few days ago with all the staff, and I had a card that looked like this, and I spoke for 40 minutes. So if anybody's worried, I won't be speaking that long, just in case they are concerned. But I did want to say a word of welcome. I've been here almost 4 weeks as dean, so I know everything about Imperial, and I know all about the business school, and I'm happy to talk to you and tell you a bit about it. I wanted to just, though, say a word of welcome and a word of introduction. I've been a dean in a couple of different places, at HEC Paris and at the business school at McGill University in Canada, but I spent the last few years actually at home, quite blissfully, on the west coast of Canada. And when I was thinking about this conference, I was thinking about experiences of the last year or so. I live in a rainforest on the west coast of Canada, on Vancouver Island. And last summer, the island was cut in two by a forest fire. You know, I think about it, we've all had these personal experiences, I think, with the effects of climate change. The island was cut in half by a forest fire. The only route from east to west was closed for over 2 months in the middle of the summer season. You can think of the economic impacts, the personal impacts, the potential health impacts, all the things we need to do to try to mitigate those impacts, the risk management, all of the things that need to take place, the financing of infrastructure. In part, it was closed not just because of the fire, but the infrastructure of the roads was destroyed and had to be redeveloped and rebuilt. You all know this much better than I do, but I think we each have a personal story about how the effects of climate change are touching us in very, very direct ways. And I think the reason, in part, I came to Imperial after all the experiences I've had is because this is a place that tries to tackle those kinds of big questions and does it by looking across disciplines. And when I think about what the center does, and I think about what our finance group does, and I think about what science at Imperial does, it's to come together across disciplines to tackle those kinds of big questions. You know, this is what Hugh Brady, our president, calls a STEM B institution: science, technology, engineering, medicine, and business. And I think if we're going to be committed to trying to solve these problems, as I was talking earlier a bit with Professor Skea, I said, you know, to my mind, now I come from sort of a business world and business perspective, we need government to solve these problems, but government's not going to solve these problems. But all of us coming together, and as he reminded me, they do set the tone for how we're going to attack these problems. But all of us coming together, thinking about the economic systems, thinking about our social systems, are what it takes to solve these problems. And it strikes me that centers like this and this conference and all of you coming together, and if I think about it, I think in this room today, you know, we have scientists from Imperial, we have scientists from our own finance department in the business school, we have people from business, we have people from government and government institutions, we have people from NGOs, all coming together. And I think it's that kind of convening facility at Imperial that's so remarkable, our ability to sort of step out and tackle these kinds of big questions. So thank you all for joining together to do that. I think your collective involvement is just essential to solving these problems. We don't get to do these things unless people come together to help us do them as well. You help by your participation, and of course, people help with their sponsorship. So I also just wanted to thank the sponsors of the center and the various sponsors of this event. And I'll apologize if I don't get them all here, but Quinbrook Infrastructure Partners in Singapore, Green Finance, who I think are major partners of the center, Standard Charter, Munich Re, Standard & Poor's, and 91. I just want to say thank you to all of you, because we don't get to kind of push the boundaries of excellence and push the boundaries of outreach in particular, unless we have people generously supporting us. I hope you all have a great day together and that lots of interesting ideas bubble up, and perhaps for some of the students, researchers in the room, that your next research projects bubble up from this as well. So thank you, everyone, and I'll turn things over to Robert to say a few words.
Good morning. My name is Robert Kosowski. I'm the head of the Department of Finance. I don't want to delay the proceedings more than necessary, but I just wanted to use this time to thank my colleagues for putting on another very interesting event, welcoming you warmly and also advertising the Department of Finance. And I'll tell you in a moment why I think that might be necessary. I have a bit of historical perspective, and the Department of Finance has come a long way. We have several research centers. We've got the Center for Climate Finance and Investments, the Brevin Howard Center for Financial Analysis, the Center for Financial Technology, and recently also another attempt to collaborate with other parts of the university through the Center for Excellence in Quantitative Finance. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about the excellence in the department, and hopefully you will spread the word. Maybe you reach out to us and collaborate with us. Two pieces of information. We are scientists, so we believe in data. You may have heard of the European Commission and the so-called Horizon Europe program that it has. So this is a very large grant program. And there are very prestigious research grants called the European Research Council grant. And I'm very happy to share my pride in the department with you, because in the Department of Finance we've got 6 of those. In the sense we've got 6 holders, current or previous, of European Research Council grants, and per capita this compares very favorably to our competitors. I was surprised myself to find out that we are now, in terms of the finance department, a bit bigger than London Business School when I count the number of professors that we have, compare very favorably to the London School of Economics. Now, size doesn't imply quality, but when we look at our research output in sort of the equivalent of what you would think of in terms of Nature or Science, so we've got our own finance, economics journals, our per capita output is also very good. So we've come a long way. We are very happy to be in London here with other competitors with whom we collaborate. But the reason why I wanted to share a couple of words with you about this is that it seems the message hasn't spread yet. So we recently had an executive education program where we asked our participants how many of them, this was a custom program, had heard of Imperial Business School. And it was a small group, but very few hands went up. So please spread the word about the finance department, about Imperial Business School, and I wish you a very enjoyable event, and look forward to speaking to you during the breaks. Thank you.
Right, good morning everybody. So my name is Mike Wilkins. I'm the Executive Director for the Centre for Climate Finance and Investment, or CCFI for short. I'm here basically to quick introduction, and also my leadership team are here. You already heard from Dalia, and you'll be hearing from our academic director, Enrico Biffis, in a few seconds. But before we do that, I just wanted to sort of set the scene for today's conference and just give you a little bit of background and context in terms of what we're doing, and also run through the highlights of the agenda, which you can see in front of you. So first of all, this is the second edition of the New Frontiers of Climate Finance Conference. So we ran our first event last year. It was very successful. And we once again want to showcase the latest thinking and research from Imperial, not just from the team at the CCFI, who are all here today, but also from many other parts of the university, which together make Imperial the leading global centre of academic excellence in the fight to tackle climate change through scientific, technological, and financial innovation. So it's estimated that somewhere in the region of $1 trillion per annum is required in renewable energy alone in the next 5 years to meet the world's global need for tripling capacity. Indeed, one of the biggest questions arising from the UN General Assembly and the numerous side events taking place in New York this week is what progress, if any, will be made at COP29, the climate change negotiations taking place in Baku in November, especially in the world of climate finance. Negotiators at COP will be focusing on the new collective quantified goal on climate finance, or NCQG, a rather ugly acronym, I must say, but it does set the new climate finance ambition to be included in the negotiating text for COP29. And getting a fair share of clean energy funding will be a key fight for developing countries at Baku. Already some countries, like India, are calling for the figure to be in the trillions of dollars, which the European Union has said is unreachable. But rich nations have a patchy record on meeting climate finance promises, previously missing the deadline to provide up to $100 billion per year set back in 2009 at Copenhagen, which I had the privilege to be at. So will this year be any different? Today, you will be hearing from leading scientific and finance experts at Imperial and also from industry on how climate finance and investment can be potentially scaled up. The extent of the challenge from a scientific perspective will first be laid out in a keynote address by Professor Jim Skea, Chairman of the IPCC, of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We shall then move quickly on to the fast emerging topics of climate and nature, and how the investment community is now focused on new methods and tools for addressing biodiversity and capital depletion. After a short break, expert panelists will explore the carbon accounting's role in helping achieve climate targets before we delve into the economic and policy challenges financing the energy transition and how these barriers may be overcome. After the lunch break, we should be diving into the latest academic research around green securities design and the role of financial instruments in decarbonisation in a session led by Professor Franklin Allen from the Brevin Howard Centre here at Imperial. And the latest thinking on carbon pricing and the role it plays in decarbonisation, as well as its potential impact on industry and finance, will then be explored before we move into a second keynote address by Imperial's Professor Marcin Kaspersek on the pricing on transition risk. After the tea break, a panel of experts led by the CCFI's academic director and associate professor Enrico Biffis will focus on the role of the insurance sector in de-risking climate exposure. We shall then move on to new and innovative financial instruments for scaling up finance to fund adaptation and resilience, in the panel led by Raffaele Della Croce from the CCFI. And then finally, the last panel of the day will be somewhat different. In a question time format, the BBC's Jordan Dunbar, co-host of the Climate Question podcast, will moderate what we hope will be a fast-paced and interactive Q&A session where you, the audience, will submit your questions via Menti to our panel of leading experts at Imperial on the new frontiers of climate change. We shall no doubt hear from the latest science on tropical cyclone risk from Professor Ralph Toomey at the Grantham Institute, the cost implications of decarbonisation pathways from IPCC contributor Professor Yuri Rojli, as well as the latest on blended finance from Dr. Vivian Foster from the Centre for Environmental Policy at Imperial. So a packed agenda, I think you would agree. And finally, as we said, today would not have been possible without the kind support of our sponsors and supporters, Quimbrook and Singapore Green Finance Centre. And we're also very grateful to the BBC for allowing Jordan Dunbar to host our last session. We hope you'll find today insightful and thought-provoking. Please don't hesitate to get in touch with the CCFI if you wish to explore any of these topics further. And we are always open to funded collaborations with industry partners, NGOs, as well as academic colleagues. And we hope that today will inspire you and help us address the biggest challenges focused on mobilizing finance to secure a better future for all of us. Thank you. So I'd like to now hand over to Enrico for a couple of words before our keynote.
Yeah, thank you very much and welcome everyone. I don't want to delay any further the keynote. I just wanted to thank you for being here. It's such a pleasure to see so many new faces, but also old friends from academia and industry. In particular, I'm grateful to see those that traveled from further afield, North America, Africa, the Middle East, Asia. So you are living proof of the impact of our work. So Thank you very much. I'm very much looking forward to an exciting conference today.
We come to the end of the introductions, you'll be pleased to hear, so we'll get on with the main business of the day. So first of all, I'd like to welcome Professor Jim Skea, Sir Jim Skea, who is the IPCC chair and will be talking to us around why climate science will help us tackle the climate crisis, or hopefully will, and the role of finance within that. So Jim, over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Michael. I just say it's a pleasure to be invited to come and do this keynote and return to Imperial College. I have been chair of IPCC for just over a year now, and my term of office lasts until the end of the current cycle, so I could be around till 2030 in this current role. It's a bit far ahead. Just to say, I was the co-chair of IPCC Working Group 3 on mitigation in the last cycle, and we were actually based at the Centre for Environmental Policy here at Imperial College. So I still rejoice in the role of emeritus professor here at Imperial. Now, what I will do, I'll try to do two things. First of all, summarise the key findings from the last cycle of IPCC. But I also want to spend a little bit of time looking forwards to what the challenges will be in the 7th cycle and what IPCC's plans actually are. But first of all, just a reminder of what IPCC is and what it is not. It is not a purely science body. It's an intergovernmental body under the UN system, effectively a science policy interface. And every word of an IPCC report has been accepted by consensus by all the governments that make up IPCC. And that gives it a particular rigor and power. And the challenge is it's on the screen, I won't read it all out, but it is to assess the available literature relevant to climate change and also climate action, which includes adaptation and mitigation. IPCC does not make recommendations. They are neutral with respect to policy, so we offer options and explore the consequences of exercising options, but we do not make specific recommendations. So we're not an advocacy group, that is absolutely sure. Now, IPCC has had a huge impact on the international climate policy and diplomacy. We've been through 6 cycles since it was first formed in 1988. The first report preceded the agreement on the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and influenced the way it was put together. The second assessment report influenced the Kyoto Protocol back in the 1990s. The 5th assessment report fed into and was the basis for the Paris Agreement. And in the last cycle, we had some very influential reports, including the special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees, which was critical in establishing the basis for net zero targets that have been picked up by governments and by companies. So I think you'll agree IPCC has had a very important role to play in the policy process. That continues. I won't go, there's an awful lot of detail in there, but we go to all of the COPs, we go to all of the intersessional subsidiary body meetings in Bonn that take place once a year, and there's a great call. I mean, I get the privilege of a 3-minute speech in the opening ceremony of the COP, for example, but the more important things happen under the surface in terms of our engagement with the presidencies, the UNFCCC Secretariat, and individual countries. So one of the challenges of reporting on IPCC is that in the last cycle, all of our reports added up to 10,000 pages overall. So if I have 20 minutes, just do the calculation, 500 pages a minute is what I've got. So what we've tended to try to do is think of ways of summarizing the conclusions in a different kind of way. So what I'm going to do is try to summarize what IPCC said about each of the 3 goals of the Paris Agreement in Article 2. The first one, the long-term temperature goal, which is not a single number. The long-term temperature goal is that entire sentence, which includes the limiting to well below 2 degrees, pursuing efforts to limit to 1.5 degrees. Now, over the last couple of COPs, the dial has shifted towards the 1.5 degrees. If only the real world had shifted towards 1.5 degrees, it might have been more helpful. The second goal concerns adaptation and resilience. It is inevitable that the world is going to have to face up to the impacts of climate change, and so the ability to adapt to the changes that we see and build resilient economies and societies is absolutely critical. And the third one, which is absolutely critical for this conference today, is the question of so-called means of implementation, making finance flows consistent with a pathway towards both low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. And just as a reminder, all this is in the context of sustainable development and efforts to eradicate poverty, as many delegations constantly remind us. So let's take the three goals in sequence. First of all, on the long-term temperature goal. And these are classic IPCC kinds of diagrams running out through the 21st century that assess the hundreds of scenarios that have been published that are compatible with 1.5 or 2 degrees warming, or indeed just carry on with business as usual. And I think it has been mentioned that Yuri Rogel from the Grantham Institute will be at the conference later. And I have to say this is Yuri's speciality, analysing these kinds of scenarios. So on the left-hand side, we've got global greenhouse gas emissions, and the right-hand side focuses on carbon dioxide specifically. And carbon dioxide matters a great deal, partly because it's the most important greenhouse gas in terms of contribution to global warming at the moment. But carbon dioxide accumulates in the atmosphere. Once it's up there for hundreds of years, so you cannot go back. So it's important that CO2 is singled out. So the blue bands in these diagrams are scenarios that were judged to be compatible with 1.5 degrees warming. The purple band just above it, scenarios compatible with 2 degrees warming. And the huge salmon slice is just basically different estimates of where business as usual might take us. Now, you can look at these diagrams and see the point at which you get to net zero. So for carbon dioxide emissions in 1.5, it's roughly mid-century is where you would need to be. And it would be into the 2070s, 2080s for carbon dioxide in a 2-degree scenario. Greenhouse gas emissions overall, it would be late 21st century for 1.5 degrees, but in fact, under the 2-degree scenarios, greenhouse gas emissions would not reach net zero during the 21st century, something that we find very difficult to explain to some governments, I have to say, but that's what the science is telling us. Now, if we focus into the slightly nearer term and take to a 2050 time horizon, again, this is showing 4 different sets of scenarios. The trend from currently implemented policies suggested that emissions of greenhouse gases would actually go up during that period very slightly. To be compatible with 1.5 degrees, you need to be on that blue pathway, which contains the magic number that found its way into the UNFCCC documents, that emissions should be 43% lower by 2030 than they were at the start of the process. The green one is the numbers for 2 degrees, and the purple one with the kink in it in 2030 is saying what would happen if current nationally determined contributions were fully implemented by 2030, which is a slight decrease, and then after that what would need to happen to put you back onto a 2-degree scenario, which involves very deep emission reductions in terms of the speed at which it takes place. So a strong message there on the mitigation side. There are 2 gaps here in terms of implementation. The first one is the emissions gap. the nationally determined contributions we currently have are not nearly sufficient to put us on a pathway to meeting the long-term temperature goal in the Paris Agreement, which is somewhere between the 1.5 and 2 degrees bracket. Secondly, there's an implementation gap because there is not enough policy on the ground to allow the nationally determined contributions to be met. And what is absolutely critical at next year's COP in Belém in Brazil in 2025, COP 30, there will be a new set of NDCs need to come forward, which will be critical in determining what kind of progress we make. So it's a pretty bleak picture in terms of meeting the overall targets. I'll try to bring some optimism when I get on to the other goals. Now, in terms of resilience and adaptation, it's also not a happy picture. What this one, with scientists in Working Group 2 of IPCC who look at impacts and adaptation have developed these diagrams which are the so-called burning embers diagram, which are supposed to represent the intensity of the colour represents the level of risk. And you can think this is impressionistic, but there's a science behind the Pantone numbers on this, believe me. It's actually quite rigorous when you look behind it. But just to give a sense of calibration, the purple one, which is very high risks, means that you're looking at extremely serious risks with major effect on nature or human well-being that are irreversible in nature. So that's the kind of the range that you've got there. Now, one of the depressing things about the 6th assessment report and comparing it with the results in the 5th assessment report, the AR5, is that for a given level of warming, it was assessed that the risks are much higher than were previously thought. So not only, as Peter Todd said at the beginning, we are seeing temperatures now, warming levels that we had not expected to see. For a given warming level, the impacts appear to be worse than we had previously anticipated. So the wildfires on Vancouver Island that have been replicated in many other parts of the world are part of that picture. And what you can see here, because we have a warming calibration on the vertical axis, we are now in the position for many unique and threatened systems that we are getting to risks above 1.1 degrees warming that we previously did not think were going to be there. And by the time you get to 2 degrees warming, we are really seeing extremely concerning levels of impact. The risks differ by different systems. So on the left-hand side, we have the risks for land-based systems. On the right, the ocean and coastal ecosystems. Just to say, the land-based system risks appear to be higher, with one exception, the warm water corals on the right-hand side, where even at 1.5 degrees warming, we would expect to see something like a 75% loss of warm water corals. At 2 degrees warming, that loss is pretty much complete. But I think if you look to the left-hand side of it, I think the concerning issue is what difference it makes between 1.5 and 2 degrees. The risks at 2 degrees are much higher than 1.5. So we're particularly picking out there wildfire damage, permafrost degradation, biodiversity loss are all things that we're starting to see. And at higher levels of warming, you start get threats to food systems and potential for food prices as well. So again, a depressing picture. Sorry, we do try to keep some hope in here somewhere, I promise you. And part of the hope is that adaptation action can actually make a difference, because what the scientists looked at, left-hand side, there's a big related for heat-related morbidity and mortality at different levels of warming. Adaptation actions can make a difference and reduce the risks. So part of the future portfolio for climate action has to be this ability to adapt and reduce the levels of risk. Same thing on the right-hand side for food security, which is affected by patterns of economic development. Now, just finally, I'm sorry about the quality of this slide. The reason was governments wouldn't approve it, and so it was never produced in there. It's there in the technical summary of our reports, but not the summary for policymakers. We did have in the Working Group 3 report in the last cycle a whole chapter on investment and finance, and one of the quantitative parts of it was to compare current investment flows for mitigation with the flows that would be needed if you were in scenarios compatible with 1.5 or 2 degree warming, and this has a 2030 time horizon. So the comparison was made for mitigation by sector, looking at energy efficiency, transport, electricity, and agriculture and land use. It was divided by the type of economy, developed or developing, which was the reason that the report wasn't approved because of disagreement about that, and also by region. And the big strong message, you know, the financial flows are a factor of 3 to 5 short of what would be needed to put you onto these 1.5 or 2 degree trajectories. The gap is least for energy supply and renewable energy, which has been a success. It is biggest for agriculture, forestry, and land use in terms of ratios. And worthwhile saying, we could not collect the same data for adaptation. This is a particular issue that we need to do much more work on adaptation financing in the next cycle. Just to say one thing, just to be optimistic about it, we did identify many options now that offer the potential to reduce emissions in the short term, and renewable energy stands up. The blue part of the curve means it pays for itself. The cost is less than zero to be able to do it. So this has been a huge success over the last few years. But just to flag out other areas, bioelectricity, and at the bottom, reducing methane emissions from oil and gas, fugitive emissions from oil and gas systems is absolutely critical. It's been neglected so far, very cost effective, and because methane has a short lifetime in the atmosphere, it can have a big impact and could affect peak warming in quite an important way. So that, in just a few minutes, is the entire 10,000 pages of the last set of IPCC reports. Now, where are we going in the future? We have got 2 invitations from the Framework Convention on Climate Change outstanding. One from the first global stocktake, if we can align our timetables with the global stocktakes under the Paris Agreement. And secondly, under the Sharm el-Sheikh work programme on the global goal on adaptation, to consider updating technical guidelines last produced in 1994 on assessing impacts and adaptation. I was astounded to find that I was actually one of the experts that produced the 1994 guidelines, and I have no memory of it whatsoever. So institutional memory is really not very helpful there. Okay, so what are we going to do during the cycle? After hours and hours of negotiations, the government's decided earlier this year that we would produce the 3 same usual working group reports on the physical science, impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability and mitigation in that order unless otherwise decided. But governments could not agree on the timeline by which these reports would be produced. So the invitation from the Framework Convention there is still outstanding. This is all stuff that's already underway. A special report on climate change in cities has been scoped, and our working groups are currently selecting the authors for that. And one thing I also want to flag is that we have a forgotten part of IPCC, the Task Force on National Greenhouse Gas Emission Inventories, which develops the methods by which governments report their emissions and sinks to the Framework Convention. And they have been asked to produce a report on short-lived climate forces, which includes things like SO2 and NOx, and also, very interestingly, to produce a methodology report on carbon dioxide removal technologies and carbon capture utilization storage. And this is not an assessment report, it is just to work out the methods by which you report the levels of capture. And I think it promises to be quite a controversial report. There's a scoping meeting in Copenhagen in about 3 weeks' time. And finally, IPCC did agree to revise and update the technical guidelines on impacts and adaptation, with a special emphasis on adaptation indicators and metrics. And I do think this is critical for the question of adaptation finance, because unless you measure it, you cannot invest against it. And I hope that this will provide a mechanism by which certainly much more private money can go into the adaptation sphere. And finally, the synthesis report for the 7th cycle. They have agreed to produce a synthesis report. That's my personal responsibility to do that. So that is my task for 2029. So that is basically a quick summary of where we're going. And just to emphasize, the next cycle is going to be have a strong emphasis on adaptation and resilience. So I'm really pleased to say you have a session on that later in the day. And indeed that somebody from the business school is actually going to the scoping meeting for the whole reports in Malaysia at the end of the year to help us decide how to include these things in. But just to summarize it, IPCC is not 5 professors sitting in the back of a pub stitching things up. It is an intergovernmental body with 195 governments involved, and getting that consensus is hard work. So just to say, this illustrates the journey. I think the top left-hand corner is actually the UN campus in Nairobi. That's what a plenary session looks like when it starts in an orderly way. The bottom left-hand corner is where it goes when you're actually trying to get an agreement offline. And it's only at the end of multiple hours of negotiating that you can bring down the gavel and get a decision on things. So I hope we can get down the gavel quickly at future meetings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim. That was really insightful. And it's great to know also that the business school will be inputting into the IPCC process later on this year in the scoping for AR7. So I'd just like you to join me in thanking Professor Jim Skea for his time.